Oh, guys, what's up? Yeah. Today's video is brought to you by, actually, still nobody, but we got big things going on. I'm going to be pulling these bad boys out, probably sticking them in my spare bedroom that I use as storage, or a guest room when I have, like, guests in town. But, hey, we're going to try something different in here. I mean, these are still good. It's just, I've been beating on them for a while. Hard. I mean, I'm very tough on subwoofers. But anyway, guys, I got another idea. Really, I'm gonna have to do some measuring, but over the winter, I'm thinking about putting 2 more fittings in here for a total of 6. I don't know. It's just a thought. But today we're going to talk about enclosures and wood. And what brought this on is in one of the basehead groups on the old face page, I got up on a post about the price of an enclosure. And I mean, I think it was a 215 enclosure, and the guy was quoted around $700 to $800, and everybody's like, oh, that's way too much. You should be able to get an enclosure for $200 to $300. No. Especially at wood price right now. Wood's like really expensive right now. And I think it did dip a little bit from where it was at, but it is still very expensive. Especially if you use good wood. And that's a whole nother subject in itself, you know. But an enclosure, I mean, you're paying one for the supplies that it took the person to build it. And if they're using like good wood and good screws and everything like that, if they're hiding the screws, you're paying even more. And if you're getting some fancy kind of like engraving in it done on a CNC, you're paying more. Plexi window, you're paying more. The finish they put on it, you know, are they just painting it, or are they leaving it raw, or are they actually staining it and going back over it with like a polyurethane or epoxy or something like that? That all plays a big role in it. But the biggest role to come into this is how good is the person building it. And good that's a very broad subject, because, you know, there's guys out here that have been doing woodwork half their life. They could build you a beautiful enclosure, but wouldn't be worth a shit, you know, like in response. So you got to find somebody that A, does good woodwork, and B, knows how to build an enclosure. And for the guys that's been doing that for a long time, like Loud Grandpa, Kerry Stahl. I mean, God, that dude's old as dirt. I mean, he's probably been building enclosures 50 years. I love that dude. But no, he does build a really nice enclosure, and his enclosures perform extremely well. So, you know, you take a Kerry Stahl enclosure and compare it to, you know, the local young dude that's been doing it for 3 years in his backyard or whatever, and Kerry's enclosure is going to blow him away. You know, he might be cheaper, but in a situation like that, cheaper ain't always best. So you're gonna pay more for an enclosure that looks good, performs good, and built out of good material. So them 3 factors right there will determine the price of an enclosure. And if you have all 3 of those on the better side of the spectrum, you might pay 4 times more for an enclosure. You know, it might be the difference between a $200 enclosure and a $700 enclosure. So that's kind of what I wanted to cover today, because, you know, this thread was just full of people talking about price. Like, oh, I got my 215 enclosure for $300, and, you know, I got my enclosure for $150, and dude down the road built mine for $2. He builds beautiful enclosures. Yeah, they didn't look that great, but still, that's where the price tag comes in, guys. You know, quality material, knowledgeable builder, and a builder that makes a pretty enclosure. Like, I do shitty woodwork, guys. I can build a good enclosure. I have the knowledge, but it just, I do shitty woodwork. It's gotten better though. Like my cuts with the circular saw from when I first built this to I built the wife's blazer, I mean, they're 100 times better now. But shit, I hadn't built anything out of wood in like years when I built this. And this is built out of cheap pine plywood. And that's, you know, another thing, material. This is built out of cheap pine. And that's why it looks the way it does. You can see all the texture in there, you know. It ain't sanded pine. I really did, I did cheap out on it. And you can do that if you're building something like this, you know. I wish I'd have went back and done like the final inside layers out of at least sanded pine. But when I went and bought wood, I think I bought 12 sheets of regular old pine, you know. And the reason I'm even bringing this up, because good wood, you know, especially if you're building just like a no-wall box, you really want to build all of it out of good wood. But doing a big wall like this, the reason I could get away with doing cheap pine is because everything on here is 3 layers thick. And that does play a big part of it. And, you know, you got to do your first layer, like the outer shell. And then I went back in and kind of staggered the layers. And when I'd put like the second layer in, I would cover the back of that second layer with tight bond wood glue. Like I literally would just pour it out of the gallon on the board, spread it out, stick it up there and screw it. And that shit holds so good. At that point, you know, the wood went from this thick to that thick. I did that for all 3 layers. And then you can see I spared nothing on bracing. And even though my baffle is only 3 layers thick, underneath it, there is a lot of steel bracing like that. And that's a big key into an enclosure. So my enclosure's built right. Pretty knowledgeable built, you know, designer of me. But overall, I did use cheap wood. And like I said, you know, that's why I was explaining how you can get away with using cheap wood. Cheap wood don't look as good. It would take a lot of work to sand that down all smooth and get a pretty finish on it. But that wasn't the point that I built this thing for. But, you know, when you're using 3 layers or more, then using really high dollar wood like birch or something, you can kind of skip that. I really do like the maple that I built the wife's enclosure out of, just because that wood was so hard. I mean, dude, I had to use a certain brand of deck screw to screw that together, because the couple first types of deck screws I tried, they would just snap off. Like you'd start screwing in it and it'd snap off. Deckmate, Home Depot, only place I found them, but there's a brand called Deckmate. Them screws would just run right in. But I do like that maple. That was some hardwood. It was sanded really pretty. God, it was some good wood. But anyway, God, that sounded terrible, guys. I just kind of wanted to touch on the price of an enclosure, because so many people on that post, you know, it seemed like all they were worried about as a whole was the price point. They didn't care about quality or knowledge of the builder or the final product, you know. And all that plays a big decision. Like, you might want an enclosure. You might find a good, knowledgeable builder, man. He's going to build you a badass enclosure to perform well. And in his mind, he might be, you know, already have an idea like, hey, we'll throw some dark cherry stain on this bad boy, give it an epoxy, you know, finish, you know, polish it out, make it shiny, you know, like a diamond in a goat's ass. It's going to be blinging. And, you know, he might hit you for $750. And then you might be like, well, I don't really need the finish on there. I just want raw wood. And your price might jump down to $500. You know, you don't know. That's why you need to thoroughly discuss everything with the builder and go from there, because a lot of people, they have a different idea in their head than what you do for your enclosure. And I'm that way with tattoos all the time, man. When somebody wants a tattoo and I price it, I can kind of go over what they give me as far as details. I'll get a thought in my head, and I like to go overboard sometimes. And, you know, they'll look at me after I give them price, and they're like, that a little high for you? And they're like, yeah. And I'm like, well, we can leave this, and this out. You know, a lot of the bells and whistles get the price down. And sometimes they want that, or I tell them exactly what I plan on doing, and they're like, hey, let's go with that. So that's what it all boils down to, guys. But I hope this helps some of y'all and makes things a little better. You know, gives you a better idea of why enclosures cost what they do. Building materials alone, I mean, but anyway, hope all y'all have a great day. Everybody have a great day. Peace out. And as always, guys, base on!